In the archives of New Orleans, there survives a notice so small, most readers would miss it. April 3rd, 1824. Fire destroys Marrow House in Ashwell Parish. 9 dead. 1 suspect apprehended. That was all. No screaming headline. No civic outrage. No week of public mourning. Just a clipped paragraph, wedged between shipping rates and sugar prices, as if 9 prominent men burning to death in a locked plantation office was an inconvenience best folded into the classifieds. By the end of that same week, authorities said the matter was solved. An enslaved man named Elias had done it. He had fled toward the river. He was captured. And he was hanged before any formal trial could force the story to survive questioning. Case closed. But the deeper you go into the Marrow House fire, the less it resembles a solved crime, and the more it resembles a burial, not just of bodies, of evidence, of memory, and perhaps of something far older than the house itself. Marrow House stood west of Baton Rouge, on a strip of profitable riverland owned by Chancellor Lucien Voss, a jurist whose opinions were quoted in both Louisiana and Mississippi. To polite society, Voss was a patron of churches, a benefactor of roads, and a defender of order. To the people who labored under his roof, he was something else entirely. Payroll ledgers show household staff turning over at an abnormal rate. Parish purchase records show unusual payments to intermediaries who never appear in crop accounts. And private letters from rival planters describe Voss with a phrase that appears more than once. He keeps too much below the house. On the night of March 31st, 1824, Voss hosted 8 guests at Marrow House. Not a social dinner, not really. The men were tied together by shipping interests, insurance claims, and a commercial partnership whose books become strangely thin in the months before the fire. One merchant's wife later told a priest that her husband spoke of a final discussion at Voss's estate, something about sealing the breach before more eyes turned south. That statement never appeared in official parish summaries. The dinner was expected to end before 10. None of the men ever left alive. Shortly after 2 in the morning, workers from a neighboring cane property saw an orange wash above the trees. By the time they arrived, the main residence was already beyond saving. The front shutters had been pinned from the outside. 2 service exits had been fastened shut, and inside, the 9 victims were found not scattered through a panicked escape, but concentrated in Voss's records office, a room whose outer lock had also been engaged. That detail alone should have exploded the official narrative. How does one fugitive servant trap 9 powerful men in a locked interior room, secure multiple exits, and ignite separate points of fire before anybody stops him? Authorities never answered that. They simply moved faster. 3 days later, they announced that Elias, described only as a literate field hand of about 28, had been captured near a packet landing upriver. In his possession, they said, was Chancellor Voss's signet ring and a folded letter sealed with dark wax. The ring was returned to surviving relatives. The letter was placed into evidence, then vanished from parish inventory within 18 months. Elias was executed the morning after his arrest. No transcript of questioning survives. No signed confession survives. No grave with his name survives. What does survive are fractures. A coroner's memorandum notes smoke damage in the lungs of all 9 men, meaning they were alive when the fire spread. A separate unsigned notation, tucked into a survey bundle decades later, states that soot patterns suggested ignition in at least 3 different areas of the lower floor. Another record, never meant for publication, observes that boot impressions led away from the eastern garden after the fire. Boots of expensive make, narrow-heeled, the sort Voss himself favored in imported orders from France. So either Elias worked a miracle under impossible conditions, or Someone wanted the scene read a certain way. For nearly 40 years, the Marrow House fire drifted towards silence. The estate decayed. A chapel ledger marks the land as avoided by local children. A tax map from 1849 labels the parcel simply unsafe for tenancy. Formerly influential relatives left Ashwell Parish one by one. Even the Voss name thinned out, as if the family preferred distance over inheritance. Then, in 1863, Confederate engineers surveying abandoned sites for possible storage use filed a note that should have reopened everything. Beneath the ruins of Marrow House, they wrote, was a masonry substructure extending beyond the footprint shown on civil plans. Access appeared blocked. Venting shafts were present where no wine cellar needed them. Further inspection recommended. No further inspection happened. After the war, the property passed through speculators, timber syndicates, and one northern investor who abandoned the purchase after a single night on the grounds. In a letter to his brother, he wrote that voices seemed to travel through the floor, as if arguments were still taking place under his bed. Superstition proves nothing, but the pattern that followed is harder to dismiss. Land surveys went missing. Deeds were recopied with altered boundary notes. One courthouse clerk wrote in the margin of a register that earlier plats had been withdrawn by instruction. No authority named. In 1831, a Tulane historian named Miriam Vale began digging into the fire while researching illegal Gulf trafficking routes. Insurance litigation led her to a cluster of familiar names. Voss and all 8 dinner guests had stakes in 3 vessels officially engaged in legal coastal commerce. Yet the ship's return manifests failed to explain large revenue jumps, and at least one cargo claim appears to have been paid after the vessel supposedly sank empty. Vale suspected fraud at first. Then she found something worse. A notebook kept by a dockside broker referred to one of Voss's partners as needing temporary inland accommodation for unscheduled arrivals. Another fragment mentions river transfer at night. No inspection. Hold them until accounting settles. On its own, that could suggest contraband of many kinds. But when Vale cross-checked winter death entries from the Plantation Chapel, one line stopped her cold. February 1824. Female slave, Dinah. Cause, fever. Buried before physician attendance. That entry mattered because another source, an oral account recorded from an elderly black resident decades later, claimed that Elias had not arrived alone. He had come to Marrow House from Virginia with a young woman called Dinah, perhaps his sister, perhaps not, both bearing marks of prior punishment. The same account claimed Elias could read and write, and that Voss had paid an impossible premium specifically to acquire a man with those abilities. Why? Why would a Louisiana chancellor, publicly supportive of laws restricting literacy among the enslaved, overpay for a literate captive? Vale's answer came from a survey map that should not have survived. Filed before the fire and later miscatalogued under drainage improvements, it shows a substantial lower complex beneath Marrow House, accessible through the storage wing and extending far past the foundations. Not one room, several. Corridors, side chambers, thick walls, ventilation cut in deliberate angles. The plan contains no label for purpose. In 1934, Vale requested permission to excavate. Permission denied. Weeks later, her office was broken into, and her research folder disappeared. She left Louisiana within the year. By then, the mystery had already become larger than a fire. It became larger than Voss. Because if those rooms were built to conceal people, then Marrow House was not merely a plantation with secrets. It was infrastructure. In 1957, highway work less than a mile from the old estate exposed a grave pit containing the remains of dozens of black men, women, and children. County authorities removed the bones quietly and reburied them under numbered markers. Local coverage barely mentioned the discovery, but a restricted osteology memo, later unsealed in part, described repeated grooves in wrists and ankles, prolonged restraint, and signs of death by dehydration more consistent with confinement than epidemic disease. Trauma expected from open execution. It looked, instead, like abandonment. That finding gave terrifying weight to Miriam Vale's old theory, that Marrow House had functioned as a way station for the illegal slave trade years after the transatlantic ban, and that at least some captives were hidden below ground until sale, transfer, or disposal. Now the fire takes on a different shape. Maybe the dinner on March 31st was not a simple gathering of wealthy friends. Maybe it was a crisis meeting. Maybe something had gone wrong below the house. Maybe somebody talked. Maybe someone died who was not supposed to die. Maybe the men gathered there were deciding not how to save their enterprise, but how to erase it. That is where Dinah returns to the story. Oral testimony collected in the late 1950s claims she fell ill only after being taken below the residence. Another account, secondhand but persistent, says she tried to stop Elias from carrying messages for Voss and was beaten for it. Inside this case, her burial reads like a warning flare. If Dinah witnessed what was happening in the underground rooms, or if she herself was held there, her death may have been the spark that turned fear into action. Yet even that does not solve the physical problem. Elias could have motive, he could have rage, he could even have planning, but alone, he still should not have been able to confine 9 men, secure the property from outside, and start coordinated fires while leaving behind boot prints that pointed toward the master of the house. Unless Elias had help. Or unless Chancellor Voss was never merely the target. In 1966, a laborer clearing brush near the old foundation uncovered a tin dispatch box wrapped in tar cloth. He said it contained several pages written in an educated hand and signed only E. Before parish deputies took possession, he claimed to have read enough to understand 3 things. First, the writer spoke of Dinah with intimate grief. Second, he described chambers under the house where the forgotten waited in thirst and darkness. Third, he wrote that the men above intended to move what they had awakened, and that fire was the only mercy left. The box disappeared into state custody. No public archive lists it. That should sound too convenient. Another lost document, another witness on the margins, another object swallowed by official handling. And yet the story becomes stranger still. An architectural historian allowed onto the site in 1964 noted that the visible ruins seemed designed around the lower works rather than the reverse. Load-bearing lines aligned with subterranean masonry in ways suggesting the underground section either predated the mansion or was conceived before any above-ground elegance mattered. She found no geological reason for such voids. They were built, deliberately, and possibly earlier than Voss's ownership. Former groundsman later added that an old service tunnel once seemed to run toward the riverbank, wide enough for movement of goods or people, lined with stone older and finer than the plantation's own brickwork. He also claimed there were carved marks in the passage walls, symbols no one on site could identify. That odd detail might have been dismissed as folklore, if not for a surviving expense note from 1823, showing Voss paying an otherwise untraceable scholar for translation of inscriptions recovered on the property. Translation, not inventory, not masonry repair. Translation. Suddenly, Elias's literacy is no longer a side detail. It may be the center of the entire case. Perhaps Voss bought him because you could read rare scripts. Perhaps Dinah knew more than anyone realized. Perhaps the hidden rooms beneath Marrow House began as holding pens for human trafficking, but connected to something older, the traffickers barely understood and hoped to exploit. Or perhaps Voss, who dealt in human lives with enough coldness to hide them under his own floors, discovered a structure he believed could be used for profit, and only later realized it carried its own danger. This is the point where the case stops behaving like standard historical crime and begins to split. One path says Elias avenged Dinah and the dead below, burning guilty men where the law would have protected them. Another path says Voss orchestrated the fire himself, using Elias as both instrument and future scapegoat, then slipped away during the chaos. That second path sounds absurd until you look at what followed. Voss's body was never conclusively identified. The signet ring found on Elias may have been planted, payment, or proof of private contact. A witness statement from the 1850s claims Elias and Voss were seen speaking alone near the levee in the weeks before the fire. And in New Orleans records from 1829, a merchant called Lucien Marr appears suddenly with capital, vague origins, and a free black secretary listed only as E. Reed. It may be coincidence, it may be invention, but the descriptions are close enough to keep historians uneasy. Then, in 1972, a graduate student interviewing an elderly printer in Boston recorded one final thread. The printer said his former employer, a black man of uncommon education who called himself Ezra Reed, kept a fragment of an old letter in a locked drawer. On his deathbed, Reed allegedly allowed it to be copied. The fragment was undated, unsigned, and impossible to authenticate. But if genuine, it changes everything. It read, in part, "What was kept beneath that house was wicked enough in the hands of men. What lay deeper was worse. They would have opened it wider. They would have carried its knowledge outward. I chose flame over release. No names, no location, no explicit confession. But if Ezra Reed was Elias, and if the fragment was his, then the Marrow House fire was not only murder and not only rebellion, it was containment. That possibility does not redeem anyone. It does not cleanse Voss. It does not soften slavery. It does not undo the deaths in the records office or the nameless dead in the grave pit. But it does explain the ferocity of the erasure. Because if Asheville Parish contained evidence of an illegal trafficking network, of elite men starving captives below ground, and of a hidden structure old enough to force translation work no record keeper wanted preserved, then the simplest public story would always be the most useful one. A violent enslaved man, a righteous hanging, an unfortunate fire, nothing more. Simple stories protect institutions. Complicated stories threaten them. And Marrow House was complicated from the first minute. 9 men dead in a locked room, doors secured from outside, a missing letter, a vanished body, a literate captive purchased at extraordinary cost, an unexplained underground complex, human remains found nearby in restraint, records withdrawn, witnesses pressured, excavations blocked. History is not always destroyed in one dramatic act. Sometimes it is thinned, retitled, misfiled, denied access, reburied under procedure until even the scandal begins to sound imaginary. So what happened on the night Marrow House burned? Did Elias take vengeance for Dinah and for the captives left to die below the floors? Did Lucien Voss sacrifice his partners and escape into another name? Did both men, enemies or uneasy allies, decide that whatever lay under that estate could not be allowed to travel beyond it? We cannot answer with certainty. Maybe that uncertainty is the final design, because the most unsettling possibility is not that the truth was lost. It is that the truth was judged too dangerous to leave intact. And if that is true, then Elias was remembered not as what he was, but as what the powerful needed him to be, a monster large enough to seal the archive shut. The land where Marrow House stood is still empty. No museum, no monument, no public excavation. Only grass, low trees, and soil that official hands have spent 2 centuries refusing to trust. Perhaps they feared disgrace. Perhaps they feared prosecution. Or perhaps, somewhere in the first story buried under all the others, one condemned man saw something below that house and decided the world above it was not ready. Not for the evidence, not for the dead, and not for whatever waited beneath them.